Delaware 1990 cold case solved. Arrest shocks community. The porch light was still on when her daughter came home from school the next afternoon. Carol Wyndham left it on every morning for as long as anyone in the neighborhood could remember. She worked the early shift at the hospital, out the door before sunrise, and she always said she didn't want her daughter Bethany walking home to a dark house. It was the kind of small habit that becomes invisible until it suddenly means everything. On the morning of October 11th, 1990, Carol left for work the same way she always did. She locked the front door. She left the porch light burning. She turned right out of the driveway on Alderman Street in Millbrook, Delaware, population 6,400, and drove toward the hospital where she had worked as a surgical nurse for 14 years. She never arrived. Her car was found at 11:30 that morning by a county road crew, parked at an angle on the gravel shoulder of Route 9, 2 miles from the hospital, the driver's door standing open, her purse on the passenger seat, her keys still in the ignition. The engine had not been running. The radio was off. Everything was exactly as Carol had left it, except that Carol was not there. What happened in those 2 miles between Alderman Street and the shoulder of Route 9 would fracture this small Delaware town for the next 34 years. To understand what was taken, you have to understand what Carol Wyndham had built. Millbrook sits in the flat, quiet center of Kent County, Delaware, the part of the state that people from Wilmington and Dover don't think about much, which is exactly how the people who live there prefer it. It was the kind of place that still had a Saturday farmers market in the parking lot of the Lutheran church, where the same families had been selling sweet corn and jarred tomatoes since the 1960s. Where the high school football coach was also the driver's ed teacher, and everyone thought that was perfectly normal. Where people kept their screen doors unlocked through September because the summer evenings were too warm not to. Carol had grown up there. She had gone to the University of Delaware in Newark, gotten her nursing degree, and driven back to Millbrook in 1974 without any particular drama about it. It was home, and home was where she wanted to be. She was 41 years old in the fall of 1990. She had dark hair going silver at the temples, which she made no effort to conceal, and a laugh that her colleagues at Memorial Hospital described as the kind that starts in one room and ends in the next. She was Bethany's mother. That was the organizing fact of her life after her marriage to Bethany's father ended in 1985, and she had taken on the job of being both parents with the practical efficiency of a woman who assessed situations and made plans and carried them out without complaint. Bethany was 14 in October 1990. A freshman at Millbrook High, and every afternoon Carol's first question when she walked through the door was how the day had gone. Not just a gesture. She wanted the answer. She had a garden that she tended until the first frost every year, and a station wagon with a Notre Dame sticker in the rear window, even though she had not attended Notre Dame and simply liked the color of the logo. And a best friend named Patricia Doyle who worked in the hospital pharmacy and who called her every Sunday morning. She had a full and specific and irreplaceable life. She had been planning, that October, to take Bethany to Philadelphia for the weekend before Thanksgiving. A small trip, nothing elaborate, just the two of them. A hotel, the art museum, dinner somewhere nicer than they usually went. Bethany had been looking forward to it for weeks. It never happened. On the morning of October 10th, the day before, she disappeared. Carol had worked a 12-hour shift and come home tired and made soup from scratch anyway, and the two of them had eaten together at the kitchen table and talked about the trip and about Bethany's biology teacher and about whether they should get a dog. Bethany would remember, years later, that her mother had argued in favor of the dog. Enthusiastically, with specifics, she had already been thinking about names. The next morning, the porch light came on before dawn, and then it just stayed on. Bethany arrived home from school at 3:15 p.m. on October 11th to find the house locked and the porch light burning and no message from her mother. She waited. By 4:30, she called Patricia Doyle. Patricia drove over immediately, and at 5:07 p.m., the two of them called the Kent County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher who took the call initially suggested they wait. Adults sometimes make unexpected changes to their plans. But Patricia Doyle was a woman who did not accept that kind of reasoning when something was wrong. She said, "Carol Wyndham left this house at 6 in the morning, and her car is sitting on Route 9 empty with the door open, and she has not called her daughter. Something is wrong." The first deputy arrived at the scene on Route 9 at 5:41 p.m. The timeline was reconstructed in the days that followed. At 6:04 a.m., Carol had stopped at the Sunoco on the edge of Millbrook. The attendant, a man named Earl Simmons, confirmed she had bought a coffee and a pack of gum and told him she had a long shift ahead. He watched her pull back onto Route 9. That was the last confirmed sighting. Between the Sunoco and the spot where her car was found, Route 9 passed a stretch of soybean fields, a grain elevator, and a half-mile of dense scrub pine on the eastern shoulder. There were no houses. There were no other businesses. There was no reason for Carol Wyndham to stop her car there voluntarily at 6 in the morning. But she had. Or something had stopped it for her. Deputies canvassed the area. They found a set of tire tracks in the soft shoulder 20 yards ahead of Carol's car, wide-treaded, consistent with a pickup truck, pressed deep as though the vehicle had sat there for some time. They found, in the scrub pine on the eastern side of the road, a length of nylon rope, orange, the kind used for construction site fencing, that had been cut rather than broken. A single strand of dark hair was caught in the fibers. It was bagged, labeled, and sent to the State Police Crime Lab. There was one other thing, quieter than the rest, that the deputy noted in his report, and that would not be understood for a long time. On the passenger side of Carol's car, just outside the door frame, there was a faint smear on the exterior panel. Reddish-brown. Small. It could have been anything. It was not anything. The investigation passed to the Delaware State Police Major Crimes Unit within 48 hours. The lead detective assigned was a man named Elroy Stubbs, Detective Sergeant, 21 years on the job. The kind of investigator who arrived at every scene carrying a yellow legal pad and wrote everything down in a small, cramped hand, and then went home at night and wrote it again from memory to see if anything changed in the retelling. He had grown up one county over from Millbrook. He knew what these towns were. He understood that what had happened to Carol Wyndham was not supposed to be able to happen here, and he also understood that that belief, that comfort, was exactly the environment that made it possible. The first suspect was a man Carol had briefly dated in 1988, a divorced contractor named Dennis Hartwell, who had become difficult when she ended the relationship. A former colleague at the hospital had reported to police that Hartwell had appeared in the parking lot twice in the spring of 1989, apparently waiting for Carol, and had been asked to leave. But by October 1990, Hartwell had relocated to Georgia, and phone records and his employer placed him unambiguously in Atlanta on the morning Carol disappeared. He was eliminated within the first 2 weeks. The second name emerged more slowly, and from a direction no one had anticipated. A man named Raymond Poole had done electrical subcontracting work at Memorial Hospital through the summer and fall of 1990. He was 47 years old, a sole operator out of a town called Felton, 12 miles south of Millbrook. He drove a late-model pickup with wide commercial tires. He had been at the hospital as recently as October 8th, 3 days before Carol disappeared, installing updated wiring in the surgical wing where Carol's unit was based. Detective Stubbs spoke to Poole on October 22nd. He was cooperative. He acknowledged knowing who Carol Wyndham was. He had seen her in the surgical wing on his last few days at the hospital. He denied any contact with her outside the building. His demeanor, Stubbs wrote in his notes that evening, was correct in every technical sense. He answered every question. He made eye contact. He did not rush or deflect. Something was wrong. Stubbs could feel it in the way you feel a draft from a door that shouldn't be open. But a feeling is not evidence. The tire tracks were consistent with Poole's truck model, but consistent with many others as well. The rope was a commercial brand sold at hardware and farm supply stores across Delaware, Maryland, and southern Pennsylvania. The hair recovered from it was dark, like Carol's, but the 1990 technology available to the state crime lab produced no usable profile. By the spring of 1991, the investigation had no viable path forward. Detective Stubbs filed his last active case report in April of that year. He noted in the summary section, in the careful, neutral language of official documentation, that investigation of a person of interest remained incomplete due to insufficient physical evidence to support further action. He did not name Raymond Poole in the summary. He had named him in the case notes. He kept a copy of those notes at home. The years did what years do. By 1995, Bethany Wyndham had finished high school, finished a nursing degree at the University of Delaware, her mother's school, her mother's profession, a choice she never had to explain to anyone who had known Carol, and taken a position at a hospital in Newark. She drove back to Millbrook every few months, not because there was still a reason to, but because leaving permanently felt like a concession she was not prepared to make. Patricia Doyle kept the case alive the way private citizens keep cases alive, by calling. Every year, on October 11th, she placed a call to the Delaware State Police. She gave her name. She asked for any update. She was told, each time, that the case remained open and active. She had stopped believing that was quite true, but she kept calling anyway. It seemed like the least she could do for a woman who had called her every Sunday morning. In 1998, a memorial was placed in the small park near Millbrook's Lutheran Church, a stone bench with Carol's name and the years of her life on it, placed there by a group of her hospital colleagues who had taken up a collection without being asked to by anyone. The hospital administrator approved a moment of silence at the annual staff meeting every October. These were small acts of institutional memory, and they mattered. By 2005, the porch light on Alderman Street had long since been replaced by a new family who didn't know what it had meant. The house had changed hands twice. The neighborhood looked almost the same and was completely different. Detective Stubbs retired in 2009 after 38 years with the state police. At the retirement dinner, a colleague made a speech about his career and the cases he'd solved, and the clearance rate he'd maintained through 3 different administrations. Stubbs smiled and shook hands and said thank you. He did not mention the legal pad with Carol Wyndham's case notes that was still in the bottom drawer of his desk at home. He had not mentioned it to anyone, but he had not thrown it away. By 2010, Bethany Wyndham was 44 years old, 3 years older than her mother had been when she disappeared. She thought about that sometimes. She did not know what to do with it. Then, in the winter of 2023, the Delaware Department of Justice announced the expansion of its cold case review program, with specific funding allocated to the forensic reanalysis of biological evidence from unsolved cases predating 2000. The Wyndham case was flagged in the first review cycle. The evidence box came out of the state archive. The strand of dark hair recovered from the orange rope was still there. The forensic analyst assigned to the Wyndham Evidence Review was part of a joint program between the Delaware State Police and a private genetic genealogy laboratory in Virginia. Her name was Dr. Simone Arroyo, and she had been doing this work for 6 years. She had contributed to the resolution of 17 cold cases. She did not approach any of them casually. The hair from the rope yielded a partial DNA profile after extraction, not Carol Wyndham's as expected, but a second contributor. Male. The profile was incomplete by the standards required for traditional database matching, but it was sufficient for investigative genetic genealogy. Investigative genetic genealogy works by uploading a partial DNA profile to public ancestry databases. The kind of website where ordinary people spit in a tube and discover that they have third cousins in County Cork, or that their grandmother was actually from Minsk. And then, using the partial matches that come back to build detailed family trees, tracing branches forward and backward until the pool of possible contributors narrows to a single individual. The process is painstaking. It requires weeks of genealogical research for every promising lead. And it requires that the contributor, or someone genetically related to them, has voluntarily added their DNA to one of these databases. Raymond Poole had not done that, but his daughter had. In 2021, curious about her family heritage, she had submitted a kit to a consumer ancestry service and received her results and thought nothing more of it. In March 2024, Dr. Arroyo's analysis produced a match. She built the family tree. She narrowed the branches. She arrived at a name. She had been in this moment before, 17 times. It did not get easier. She printed the report. She called her supervisor. She said, "You need to see this." Within 2 weeks, Delaware State Police investigators had conducted a covert DNA collection from Raymond Poole, a discarded coffee cup from a diner in Felton, and submitted it for direct comparison. The comparison came back on a Friday afternoon in April 2024. The profile matched. The partial DNA from a strand of hair caught in a piece of orange rope on the side of a Delaware highway in October 1990 belonged to Raymond Poole. One of the lead investigators on the cold case review team called Elroy Stubbs at his home in Camden that same evening. Stubbs was 74 years old and had been retired for 15 years and was watching the Phillies game with his wife when the phone rang. He listened to what the investigator told him. He did not say much. When he hung up, his wife asked him what had happened. He said, "They got him." She had known for 15 years which case he meant. Raymond Poole was 71 years old when Delaware State Police arrived at his home in Felton at 7:15 a.m. On April 30th, 2024, he had lived in that house for 20 years. He drove a newer truck now, same brand, different color. He had attended his local church with some regularity. He had a daughter who lived in Wilmington and who called him on Sundays. He volunteered twice a year at a community cleanup organized by the County Parks Department. The kind of afternoon event where you wear a reflective vest and pick up trash along the roadside and people thank you. He had been doing that for 9 years. His neighbors described him, afterward, in the words that always follow the arrest of a man who is hidden in plain sight. Quiet, they said. Kept to himself. Wouldn't have expected it in a million years. The arrest team knocked at 7:15. Raymond Poole came to the door dressed for the day, as if he had been expecting something, or had decided, some time ago, that one morning it would be this morning. He looked at the officers for a moment. Then, he said, quietly, that he supposed he had better get his coat. He was transported to the Sussex County Correctional Center and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Carol Ann Wyndham. The news moved through Millbrook, the way news about a wound that was never supposed to have closed, and then did moves through a place, with something like grief and something like relief, and something like rage, all arriving at the same moment, in the same body. Patricia Doyle heard it from her son, who had seen it on his phone. She sat at her kitchen table. She called Bethany. Bethany Wyndham was 58 years old when she received that call. She was at work, between patients. She stepped into a supply room and closed the door and stood there in the fluorescent quiet for a while. Then she called her husband and could not immediately speak, and he waited on the line without asking what was wrong, because he already knew that only one thing could make her sound like this, and he had been waiting for 34 years alongside her. Raymond Poole pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in January 2025. He offered no statement at sentencing beyond what was legally required. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A Donna match from a single strand of hair. A daughter who sent away a kit in 2021 to learn about her heritage. A coffee cup left on a diner table. That was all it took, in the end, to close a gap that had lasted 34 years. Bethany Wyndham drove back to Millbrook the weekend after the sentencing. She parked on Alderman Street and sat in her car for a while, looking at the house. Different paint now. A basketball hoop in the driveway that her mother never would have allowed. A new front garden that somebody else had planted. It was not the same house. It was the same place. She walked to the park by the Lutheran church and sat on the bench with her mother's name on it. The inscription said the years 1949, 1990. For a long time, the second number had felt like a mistake, or a question mark, or a wound that wouldn't close. Now it felt like what it was, a fact. A complete life, even an incomplete one. Carol Wyndham was 41 years old. She had 14 years in the same hospital, and a daughter who walked into the same profession, and a Sunday phone call that never missed a week, and a garden that came back every spring. She had a trip to Philadelphia she was planning and a list of dog names she had been quietly working on in her head. She had a porch light she left on so no one ever came home to a dark house. She deserved every year that was taken from her. She deserved to come home. What this case asks us to sit with is not just the question of Raymond Poole, but the question of the architecture he hid inside. The church attendance, the community cleanup, the neighborly wave. Evil does not always announce itself. In the communities where we feel safest, it sometimes moves most freely. And the question of what we owe the people it takes, not just in grief, but in persistence, in funding, in the will to go back into a 30-year-old evidence box and try again. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer. Delaware's cold case review identified Carol Wyndham's case in its first cycle. There were others waiting. There always are. What do you think it says about our justice system that it took the consumer DNA industry, a product built for personal curiosity, to finally provide the evidence that 3 decades of official investigation could not? And what do you believe the families of the still unsolved cases owe themselves? Continued hope, or something harder and more honest than that? Let us know in the comments. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Justice found Carol Wyndham after 34 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe and find more solved cold cases waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.